Down past the level of the basement Cecilia stepped, past the entrance to Durmstrang, the door from the hall's entrance that led outside in a spiral around the lower part of the tower, past the door that led to the kitchens. Below the human living space of the school was the owlery where the post arrived, shaken from the legs of birds and collected up by a small team of elves, sorted into batches according to addressee before being delivered. Few people came down here, the smell was outrageous and the steps so dimly lit that you could easily trip and tumble 50 feet to your doom. As the thought crossed her mind, Cecilia trailed her left hand on the central stair column that supported the spiral steps in their helix. But it was worth it. 3 weeks into September and, much to the chagrin of an elf who had been sorting out letters for surnames AF, Cecilia had grabbed the pile, leafing through them before realizing she needed to be harassing the elf sorting letters to people with surnames GL. One letter, our letter, which made her heart quicken at the small letters which had been unmistakably written by her son. Cecilia moved to the window, allowing the mid-afternoon autumn sunlight illuminate the envelope, and she sat on the small sill, blocking the access of several owls who, squawking their indignation, fluttered noisily to another entrance so as to rid themselves of their burdens, in some cases rather heavy. Septimus. Her darling boy. A tear pricked each eye as Cecilia pictured his face, pictured where he would be, perhaps in the common room, perhaps in the library at Hedgewood's, telling her about his time there. He had arrived safely. He was in Gryffindor. Cecilia read the words again, that would please his father, for it had been his house too. She read on. The sorting hat hadn't sorted them, they had been told to choose. So he'd chosen Gryffindor. So had Julian. She smiled, picturing the weight which must have lifted from a little Tim's shoulders. She knew he'd worried, though he'd not said. Reading on, she discovered he liked most of his lessons and liked it at Hedgewood's, so it seemed in the letter. And his elation had grown at the end as Cecilia's heart quickened when he talked about great news Sirius was getting. She read the sentence again, the hope descending into her stomach, fading. Sirius. Getting better. Cecilia closed the letter and held it close to her chest. Sirius was getting better. She looked out of the window, at the dull line of clouds that skimmed the edge of the visible atmosphere. Well, that was something, she supposed. If he did come round, he might be able to shed some light on what had happened to them both, and then Severus could take this into account in his treatment. It just seemed so insignificant. The last time she had looked out on the same seascape, she had been commandeering a captainless boat, sailing to Britain, where the Lupin family, catalyzed by her and Remus's reunion and mutual pledge to one another in June, were to live together in peace and health. The last thing Cecilia had betted on, as she drifted off to sleep in his arms, was that she would be back here at Durmstrang 3 months later, their family trisected in such a manner. A bird narrowly missed the right-hand side of her face and, with a measure of wisdom, Cecilia got to her feet so as to make her way back up the stairs again. She'd had a letter from Septimus. He was enjoying Quidditch and, as was reflected in his manner, he'd made no mention of the fact that she had gone back to Durmstrang. Her feet pounded the stone stairs as she ascended, knowing that deep down he must be upset. "Thank you," she said to her son, present by proxy in the best Basildon bond. She could tell that he disliked her being away, but practically there was little difference here to home. Except that she could not see Remus when she liked. And you, Severus. For there was help for her husband now. At the top of the stairs, though a thick oak door, Cecilia stepped out into the entrance hall. Before her, students were milling around, analyzing the staff lesson timetable that was scrolling above the main hall's archway, that led to the school's rarely used dining room. A few caught her eye as she closed the door and a hubbub grew. Students whispered behind their hands, others scuttled over to their friends and pointed. It wasn't nefarious. The students saw staff cross the atrium so infrequently that her appearance had caused excitement. Was she about to give a lecture? Who would it be called for? Had she marked work and was about to return it? Crossing the floor, the students shouldered around her like a family of sardines, following her in bunches as she headed to the staircase that led to the teachers' quarters, noise pocketing around the individual groups of students of different ages, low and furtive. As she got to the stairs, Cecilia turned and looked at them. A sea of faces looked back, expressions of hope and expectation across each one. As she turned back to go back up the stairs, the muted chattering rose in volume. And above the noise a voice called out, "Lupin! Are your lessons today? Lupin!" When she didn't turn back and instead placed a foot on the first step, the voice got louder and more insistent. "Lupin! Mrs. Lupin! We would know whether you are teaching today." Cecilia turned back, scanning the faces of students who had now fallen silent. To address teachers directly regarding their lesson schedules was unheard of. It was traditional, however, to use just the surname of their member of staff. Whoever was shouting at her was overstepping protocol. Then she spotted him, a student that she had taught before. Ina Solheim, a fifth-year Norwegian student, dedicated and brilliant, was staring back at her. "Not today, Ina." She turned to go again but noticed that the boy had pushed past a group of girls, an insistent look on his face. "Then when?" "Excuse me for speaking out of turn," he continued, as his line crossing was being commented on by the other students who were now fixed to the spot in their effort to make sure that they themselves weren't implicated in this improper behavior. "It's just that we need genetics in order to graduate with our EWLs. There is no other teacher who can teach this to us, and we need to learn it." About to fire back a retort about speaking up, Cecilia caught his eye. Commitment was in his expression and, in the boy's eyes, resolution. He was right. In the last 10 years no one could pass any of their science-related extraordinary wizarding levels without being able to understand the foundation of genetics. She sighed. "Not today, Ina," she repeated, a softer tone to her voice, "tomorrow." She looked at the whole group of students. They all needed to know what she was required to teach, right from the first years. Cecilia smiled at these far younger students and nodded. She was needed, clearly, and for the first time she actually felt needed here at Durmstrang. Turning again, she made her way up the staff quarters stairs, this time not called back. She needed to speak to Ragnhild, talk to someone, and seeing as Professor Anderson was the only person who she spoke to here, she would speak to her. Coughing, Cecilia slowed her ascent up the stairs. The cough had been annoying her since she arrived back. At first she put it down to a virus, probably picked up at the station, but it hadn't left her yet. The door of Ragnhild's room was open and Cecilia peered inside, sagging a little. She had been so keen to speak to her friend that her absence made her feel a little empty. Sirius had made progress and she needed to share and reinforce her hope that Remus wouldn't take long to follow. Sinking down on the step with her back to Ragnhild's open door, she stared at the large blocks of stone that curved diagonally that made up the center of the spiral staircase. If only she knew more about Remus, if only she could be there, talk to him, hold his hand like a wife should. A small furnace of anger was stirred in the stomach as she recalled how Callias had blamed her for not coping with the reaction of other wizards at Durmstrang to her being the dot. If only he could see her. It wasn't the other professors that mattered really, but the students. But not to Callias, whose prime aim of her being there was for her to spy. Cecilia thumped the stone step on which she was sitting with the flat of her hand. There was nothing he could do if there was nothing left to discover now. If her time was tied up with students and with covert information which, ultimately, amounted to nothing. If she spent her time teaching to fill in the time and with what she had spare dedicated it to her husband's well-being. Getting to her feet, Cecilia climbed again the spiral steps until she reached the floor on which her room was. And she could begin by writing to her son's headmaster. Even if Severus Snape decided not to reply, she would make it clear that it was her intention to be as fully informed of her husband's progress as she could. And besides, she could ask about Septimus too. Taking a pen in her hand, Cecilia sat at her desk and wrote. "Dear Severus," she began before putting the end of the biro to her lip, pondering how to continue. "If only you could have given me some lifeline the last time I was here. Now I'm determined that I am kept informed on Remus's health." She lowered the pen, running through the sentence again in her head. That was how she felt, but she couldn't write it. "Why couldn't you have at least written back to me? You have no idea how I was feeling here." No. Laying the pen on her desk, she stared at the letters she'd made on the page, the name of her previous colleague. If only he had replied, validated her version of commonality in this world. But whatever she did was haunted, tainted, by her own past in the other place. Harry Potter and Voldemort, the lives parallel here about which Cecilia had convinced herself that, should she study to a great extent, she might uncover differences and similarities which could shed light on why the potion she had made in the other place hadn't worked. Oh, how she wished she could be free. Cecilia wished with all her heart that she could be in Britain, not least because of Remus. Putting her forehead on the desk, she screwed up the letter with her right hand and launched it in the direction of the waste paper basket. She couldn't depend on Snape, she couldn't depend on wizards. She had only one choice, only one which, deep down, she knew was the right one. She would stop here until she was allowed back home. Until then, she would teach, students needed her, and become as absorbed in work that interested her of any professor. Any professor that was whose work was as far away from conjurism as could be. 88,888,888. Torches flickered on the walls. In the intensive care wing of St. Mungo's, Sirius Black was trying to sit up, much to the annoyance of the healer who was responsible for both he and Remus. "How long am I going to be here?" Sirius asked weakly, looking around himself before resting his eyes on Remus. "And haven't you found out how to treat him yet?" The plump healer, who was trying to tuck him in, stopped suddenly and gave him a sharp look. "As you know, Mr. Black, like your own treatment, Mr. Lupin's is being overseen by Professor Snape of Hedgewood School himself." Sirius nodded back in the manner of someone who had heard the tale so often it was mere background noise for his thoughts. "And, as few people have ever studied the effects of vampirism on wizards and witches, you mustn't expect miracles." She turned and bustled over her trolley, which contained a range of treatments and potions. Sirius watched as she picked up a clear cup which contained what Sirius knew to be Wolfsbane potion. He shuddered as she brought it over and looked at it suspiciously, jamming his hand down by his side. "Now, there's no need at all to be silly. You are a grown man, Mr. Black. You know this is for your own good, even if it does taste, as you so eloquently put it yesterday, like goblin piss." Sirius gave her a look. She had been doling out aliquots of potion to him for the past 10 days now. True, it did make him feel better, but it really did taste disgusting. And he would be on it for over a month, as she'd explained, so as to cover at least one lunar cycle. Trying not to gag, Sirius pulled himself up the bed a little higher in order to neck the revolting liquid as quickly as possible, and trying not to gag. He almost managed it too, but he had not got hold of the water glass that was by his bed soon enough to wash away the taste, and he ended up throwing up on the flagstone floor. Tutting her displeasure, his healer drew out her wand. "Scourgify," she declared, pointing it to the vomit, which immediately disappeared. "Now then, Mr. Black, let's try again, shall we?" "Let's not," replied Sirius, turning away, and looking instead to the wall, swigging the water as he slaked his thirst. "That's not the attitude, Sirius," he heard a voice say, not the healer, and he turned and came face to face with Callias. He smiled, which turned into a grimace, another wave of nausea passing over him. "I know, but it tastes like piss," he replied, closing his eyes momentarily. "I know," Callias replied, pulling up a visitor's chair, a curved-backed and wooden, from the peripheral of the room. "But it's better than the alternative." Sirius blinked slowly. "Of course. If anyone knew about taking Wolfsbane potion, it was Cleus Lupin. He watched as the healer passed Sirius another cupful, and this time he was determined not to throw up, drawing deeply on the water in his glass shortly afterwards. "How's it going, Cleus?" Sirius said once the physical disgust of taking the potion had passed. "You well?" "Yes," replied Cleus, nodding to Sirius. "And you?" "Oh, fine, fine. Just throwing up after taking potion and still being in hospital after being savaged by a half-breed." He winced, the huge wound across his left shoulder and chest beginning to throb again, and turned to the healer, who was now tending Remus. "Is it time for some more painkillers?" The healer turned, shaking her head. "This evening," she replied. "And it's the codidranmol now. You've had all you're allowed of the morphine." "Great," Sirius muttered, looking back at Cleus. "Not even wizard medicine, and we're down to non-wizard painkillers." "It's because of the Wolfsbane," said Cleus evenly. "Snape needs to see how you're responding. You've got him to thank." "Vomiting," replied Sirius grumpily. "That's how I am. But I will thank him." "You'll get used to it. It's likely you'll be on it for the rest of your life. It could be worse," he added, noting Sirius's expression, blacker than his name. "The fact that you were unconscious for so long meant Snape could treat you. You won't get it as bad as me, he believes, and if you take the Wolfsbane every month at the correct time, you'll barely notice the symptoms." "Lucky me." "Yes," replied Cleus, casting a deliberate gaze across to his brother, his torso wound being treated by the healer, the drip bag containing experimental potion on her trolley waiting to be hoisted to replace the near-empty one. Sirius sighed, getting the point. "Can you tell me anything more about that day?" Cleus continued, leaning towards Sirius. "Has anything come back to you?" Sirius looked at him. He knew why Cleus wanted to know. And if he knew anything else, anything that anyone could use that might help Remus from his pitiful state, he'd be shouting it at Cleus the moment he'd arrived. He shook his head. "Only what I've told you. I've tried, believe me, Cleus," he added, looking over to his friend. "I was behind Remus. He got the worst of it. When we stepped in, we had no chance. It was as if the wizards had them trained on the door. I couldn't even get my hand to my wand, or Remus. I don't even think he knew what had hit him." He closed his eyes, shaking his head. Images from that day, when they were attacked by a werewolf and a vampire in the home of suspected conjurists who they had been sent to talk to about the very point of keeping half-breeds, illegal that it was. The conjurists are in Azkaban, the half-breeds too, under maximum security. I believe when Snape has finished with them they'll be deported. "They should be destroyed, for what they've done," growled Sirius. "I know you're a politician, Cleus, but doesn't the sight of Remus make you feel like that's what you should do?" Sirius shook his head, wincing at his pain. "European law," Cleus said simply. "Tied to Europe as we are in magical politics and law, we cannot go against the treaty, no matter what they've done. They'll be repatriated to their own countries, Romania for the vampire and Bulgaria for the werewolf, and face trial there. And we all know what will happen, soft sentences from corrupt, weak judges, supported by the European Wizarding Council, who have sworn to uphold decisions made by individual nations. And you can't pass a law to say that half-breeds can be destroyed? I mean, they're not supposed to be here. Then Europe can defend our laws. Can't you?" He broke off, watching as a figure approached. "James will be here soon," said Lily, standing by the Cleus's chair. Then she threw herself at Sirius, hugging him hard, and he yelped as she pressed herself hard against him in a hug. "Sorry," she said, standing back up. "It's just I've been down here so many times to visit you both, and now you're awake." She sighed. "It's so good to see you're awake," she concluded. "How are you?" "Honestly?" She nodded. Awful. But better than I was, thanks to Snape, so I've heard. Lily nodded. He's given it his priority, in terms of his research, that is. He's got more than enough to do with non-wizards at Hedgewood's. So you managed it, Cleus? He asked, and the head of the ministry nodded. It's gone smoothly. The students have integrated. That's the least of our worries. But, he broke off and narrowed his eyes slowly. But, of course, I expect you're not up to hearing our current affairs. Sirius shook his head. No, please. Continue. I'm bored as hell in here. The incidences of conjurism have increased, they're happening more frequently and in more places. It's becoming an underground thing. It ranges from graffiti appearing, C&Cs, which is intimidating non-wizards, to break-ins and smashing up of the shops of non-wizards, especially those whose businesses have connections to wizard matters. We've arrested and prosecuted several dozen this week alone. Sirius said nothing, but a look passed between him and Lily, a look which confirmed what they were both thinking. Cleus, far too interested in political matters before anything else, to him the be-all and end-all. How's Remus? Lily changed the subject and crossed the floor, standing next to the bed. She took his hand and held it. I can't believe. She broke off. Sirius narrowed his eyes as she looked at Cleus. Any change? I'd hoped he'd have dash. We all did, said Cleus as she held her head in her hands. There's hope. If I trust my brother's life to anyone, it'd be Snape. Between her sniffs and sobs, Lily nodded, her red hair bobbing. I know, she replied, I just hoped. Hoped what? James stood behind his wife and hugged her. Lily turned and hugged him back as he stroked her hair. That Remus might have made some progress, replied Cleus. We have Snape, he concluded. There's always hope with him on our side. Sirius. James, taking Lily by the hand, strode to bedside of his friend. It's good to see you, mate. How are you feeling? Like crap. But it's got to be no better than being a vegetable. The potion's disgusting, he added. Snape says you may be free of it, depending on how you are after the next full moon. It's an experimental potion, he said, based on his original. I look forward to full moon then, said Sirius. Cleus frowned a little but said nothing. What have I missed? Sirius continued. How's England doing? Going to be in the World Cup final if their recent performance is anything to go by. I think Sirius means with the reciprocators, said Lily. I didn't, but anyway, said Sirius, grinning at James. What's been going on? We've been busy. Conjurists, said James. Henrietta's officially missing, too. She was last seen at Strasbourg just over a month ago. No one's heard from her since then. Hen'll turn up, Sirius replied. She's probably had a disagreement with someone and decided to give the silent treatment. I do hope you're right, said Cleus. And Cecilia turned up, said Lily, glancing over to Remus. She's gone back to Durmstrang now. I hoped we'd have something to tell her by now. I shouldn't bother, not how she's behaved, Sirius said nastily. Sirius. Lily stared at him, shocked. She's changed. She's different. I feel sorry for her. What about Septimus? I bet she thought nothing of leaving her son. Again. He's at Hedgewood's, interjected Cleus. She agreed it was the best place, under the circumstances. Septimus is getting on very well, he added. I don't even think that Remus would want her back, Sirius huffed, trying to fold his arms but failing, due to his injury. I believe they agreed to a fresh start, before this happened. Of course, said Cleus. Oh. Sirius looked across at his friend and closed his eyes. If only he could do for him now what he could to help him. He'd always done what he could to help Remus, and this time he felt so useless. Now, Mr. Black. He heard the healer's voice near and he opened his eyes again. I'm afraid you're overexerting yourself. She turned to look at Callias, Lily, and James. I'm here with your medicine, she added. Then I think you need a rest. Your visitors may return tomorrow. He watched as Cleus got to his feet. We'll go, he said, nodding at the healer, before striding away. Us too, said James. We'll come back tomorrow, though, he added. Lily raised her hand before taking one last pitiful look at Remus. Sirius closed his eyes again. When he opened them again, later, blinking into the gloom, the lights were always dimmed when it was nighttime. He wondered who it was who was on the opposite side of Remus's bed, head on his chest and holding his hand. 88,888,888. It had been a lovely evening. Harry could not have chosen a better place to take Hermione for her birthday. True, it was only a pizza chain in town, but the two of them had barely been out since they had used the expenses on Hermione's government credit card to eat out in Strasbourg. Before that it had been before they had begun to save for their wedding. It had been the restaurant in which Harry had proposed to Hermione. He hadn't meant to do it there. The night he had planned involved them traveling to Trafalgar Square on the night of the 1st January, pretending to have forgotten that the New Year's celebration there would have gone on the previous evening, before getting down on one knee under Admiral Lord Nelson and asking her to be Mrs. Potter. He didn't know why he'd proposed at the restaurant. But Hermione had accepted, and that was that. Hermione hadn't wondered aloud how much the meal was costing them, but said what a lovely surprise it was. Harry had told her that his parents had paid, mainly because he wanted to show he was thinking about the wedding too. But his dad was right, women did the organizing of weddings, they knew what they wanted. All they wanted the men to do was show up, not too inebriated and smartly dressed for the photos. It had been a lovely evening, though. As their courses arrived, their discussion went from work. Hermione saying what promotions were in the offing, especially if they moved to Strasbourg, to reciprocators, discussing the heavy workload that all of Cleus's volunteers had been under over the past few weeks. But isn't it brilliant that Sirius is awake, though, said Hermione as she ate her olives. Harry nodded as he tucked into a particularly large piece of bruschetta. He'd chewed, but before he had had a chance to speak, Hermione had added, "But what about poor Remus though? I do hope it comes right for him." "I feel bad for Dad," Harry had replied, holding Hermione's hand as they waited for their main courses. "He's the one who organizes the rota for that night." But it had been Cleus who'd upped the duties, Hermione had said. And, no fault of anyone, but I for one am glad he did. Look at where we'd be if he hadn't. The Eras, you for example, would have so much to do single-handedly. And they don't only offer backup, they negotiate and try to diffuse situations. Our Eras just don't have time for that. Harry had said nothing. "Well, you don't, do you?" Hermione had asked. It was true. Though he was only a supporter, fitting in with his work with historical documents, and he'd only volunteered because Hermione had told him that they were struggling for time actually preventing crime because of the extraordinary amount of paperwork that needed to be completed because of the conjurists. Arresting a conjurist required a 4-page parchment to be completed in order to prevent accusations of a prejudicial nature being raised, and they needed to answer such questions as, was the persons involved in an activity which constituted conjurism that led to an illegal act against a non-wizard? Did you see them? Are you sure? It's just so frustrating. We're filling this all in and then they get before the Wizengamot and let off with a fine. I mean, I know there's not much else they can do, but we know we're doing our best, Harry had replied, inhaling the lovely smells that his chicken pizza was emanating in his direction. Yes. Cleus just needs enough evidence before he can propose a bill, especially when there's such a strong call from Europe to be tolerant to half-breeds. Hermione had cut into her 4-cheese pizza aggressively with her cutlery. When I get hold of whoever said it, I'll have a thing or two to say about half-breeds and security. I mean, even coming here, the amount of conjurist graffiti, it's getting right out of hand. Sirius might even have a case against those conjurists still in Azkaban, wouldn't you say? For grievous bodily harm? Hermione nodded, then shook her head. Who knows? Callias has enough to deal with. I doubt Sirius would take it to court, but he would be well within his rights to do so, though. She leaned forward. Thanks, Harry. Thank your parents. It's so great to be able to come out for a change. It's good to talk to you and not have the TV on all the time. You know, Harry had said, biting into his, I really don't mind if you choose to work at the Ministry, even European office. I can do my work anywhere. I could work remotely if I needed to, travel in by flu every day. Hermione held his gaze, reaching for his hand. I know, she nodded. Thank you. You're always very supportive. But don't get to see you as it is, let alone if I went to work at Strasbourg. Not that I'd never like to work there, she'd added, the mere flicker of hot ambition in Hermione's eye, but there's no rush. What I do know is that Draco Malfoy has taken a keen interest in Henrietta Edwards' disappearance. Apparently there have been others, I don't know the details, but I'm guessing he thinks they're related. Harry had taken a bite out of his pizza as he listened to Hermione then talk more about Henrietta, about the fact that there was so little to go. It might be that she didn't ever want to be found. That's Cleus's take on it, unofficially, of course, Hermione had whispered covertly behind her hand. What's Sirius say about that? Asked Harry. Nothing. I don't think Cleus said that to him. He thinks she's just had a strop and would come out of it on her own. She dug into her pizza again, nodding in agreement at its flavor. If you ask me, conjurists behind it. Conjurists behind everything, if you read the Daily Prophet and believe every word, Harry had replied, grinning. A drought last year and hosepipe ban, conjurists. Snow in April, conjurists. Hermione grinned too. The fastest growing group of people to be used as a scapegoat for everything. And then he listened as Hermione had changed the subject back to their wedding, talking about invitations, numbers, prices, clothing, her dress and shoes, the number of bridesmaids, whether they should or shouldn't have favors, a master of ceremonies, when they should get married and if they wanted to save money to have a later wedding and only pay the evening meal for their guests. What presents would they give the bridesmaids and page boy? The list went on and Harry listened, nodding at convenient intervals and attempting to nod at appropriate stages. They were wedding plans, that was all. Harry's indifference blended beautifully with Hermione's natural obsession. It wasn't until halfway through the dessert that she stopped, thanking him again for a lovely evening and also for not buying her anything and using their wedding money on something that she didn't need. There'll be time, in the future. Next year you can buy me what you like. It had been a lovely evening. Harry soon called for the bill, knowing that the £5 spent on a bottle of Asti Martini for Hermione as soon as they returned back home might warrant some tutting, but mostly, he knew, she'd love the thought. The waiter returned with the bill and Hermione had noticed approvingly that the bill allowed the customer to pay in either wizard or non-wizard currencies. This point was not noted well by the three wizards sitting near the window. Their disapproval was clear for all to hear when they shouted their disgust at the waiter who had left their bill on the table, accusing them of prejudice. Around them, muted comments about overreacting were made before the wizards, clearly so by their obvious midnight blue robes and matching hats got to their feet, threatening a non-wizard man who was dining with a woman at a table near them, neither of whom had said a word to them. It was this confrontation that had led the pizza restaurant to be laying waste, one of the many, and the latest to so suffer at the hands of extremist conjurists. Within seconds spells had been fired, the first hitting the innocent man square on in the chest, his dining companion screaming for help. The waiters and the owner had come over, by which time the 3 other tables of guests, all non-wizards, had taken cover under their tables as one of the waiters, a wizard, had cast defensive spells as another had taken away the poor man. It had been clear that the waiter could not hold off all 3 of the now clearly conjurists. Their symbols were evident in the lining of their robes, and, as wanton destruction continued by the 2 other conjurists who were not involved in dueling with the waiter, Harry and Hermione joined the fray, eventually arresting the 2 who had been destroying the restaurant, much to the distress of the owner. Others came to the disturbance, alerted by Hermione, and had arrested all 3 of the conjurists, but not before the waiter had inflicted a hex on the first conjurist, the one who had originally made the comment. Looking around the restaurant as McMullen, Peaceable Furnace and Evelyn Fortescue had taken them away, the glass in the restaurant windows shattered to crystals, the bar in a similar state, broken tables and chairs and distraught customers, Hermione and Harry looked at one another. "We'll be needed to make a statement," said Hermione, looking around. "They'll need to know what happened." "But not tonight," said Harry. "We'll do it in the morning. Now I just want to take you home. Perhaps we should have stayed in for your birthday. They'll get us if they need us urgently." "And miss all of this?" Hermione smiled. "Yes. Miss all this." They walked out of the restaurant, Harry taking her hand. It had been terrifying, and they were trainers. He could only imagine the terror that the non-wizards caught up in it all had felt. "You know," said Hermione, pointing in the direction of 2 operating wizards who Harry soon recognized as his mum and dad hurrying in their direction, "I think next year, perhaps you could ask your parents to get me some bubble bath."